Two civilizations, both ancient, both powerful, both shaped by Confucius, by rice and silk, by dynasties that rose for centuries and collapsed in a single generation. China and Japan share more than geography. They share a soul. Yet today they stand apart, suspicious, competitive, unresolved. How did two giants who gave each other so much end up where they are now? Welcome back to Echo Mind Documentaries. If this is your first time here, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Let's dive back into the topic. Before there were borders, before there were flags, before the word rivalry even existed between them, there was the sea. The East China Sea sits between the Chinese mainland and the Japanese archipelago like a corridor of ancient memory. For thousands of years, that narrow stretch of water was not a boundary, it was a bridge. Merchants crossed it carrying silk and bronze. Monks crossed it carrying sutras and sacred texts. Diplomats crossed it carrying tribute and ambition. And with every crossing, something of China entered Japan, and something of Japan quietly began to change. This is the story of two civilizations bound together by one of the longest and most complex relationships in all of human history. A story of borrowing and transformation, of admiration and resentment, of war and wonder. A story that is still unfolding today. To understand the relationship between China and Japan, you have to go back to a time before Japan had a writing system, before it had a centralized government, before it had Buddhism. You have to go back to the beginning. The Japanese archipelago was inhabited long before recorded history. The Jomon people, one of the world's oldest continuous cultures, had lived on those islands for over 10,000 years. They were hunters, fishers, gatherers. They made pottery, among the earliest ever found anywhere on Earth. But they were largely isolated, shaped by their island world, disconnected from the vast continental civilization rising to the west. Then, beginning around 300 BCE, something changed. People began crossing from the Korean peninsula and from China itself, bringing with them rice cultivation, metalworking, and weaving. This migration wave, associated with what archaeologists call the Yayoi culture, transformed Japan. The islands would never be the same. But the most dramatic transformation came centuries later, during what historians call the Asuka and Nara periods, roughly the 6th through the 8th century CE. This was the era when Japan made a deliberate, extraordinary decision to reinvent itself in the image of Tang Dynasty China. The Tang Dynasty was the most cosmopolitan empire the world had yet seen. Its capital, Chang'an, was a city of perhaps 1 million people, filled with merchants from Central Asia, poets composing in a literary tradition of breathtaking sophistication, artists, engineers, philosophers, and administrators running a bureaucratic system of staggering complexity. To the Japanese court, this was the model of what a great civilization looked like. Japan sent wave after wave of official missions to China. These delegations were not small affairs. They were massive undertakings involving hundreds of students, monks, craftsmen, and diplomats who would live in China for years at a time, studying everything they could find and then carrying that knowledge home across the sea. What came back with them remade Japan from the ground up. The Japanese written language is one of the most vivid examples. Before contact with China, Japanese had no writing system at all. The solution Japanese scholars developed was to adopt Chinese characters entirely, using them first to represent Chinese words and then gradually adapting them to represent Japanese sounds. The result is one of the most complex writing systems in the world, a hybrid that still carries the fingerprints of that ancient borrowing in every character written today. Buddhism arrived in Japan from China in 552 CE, according to the traditional account, when the king of Baekje in Korea sent Buddhist scriptures and a statue of the Buddha as a diplomatic gift to the Japanese emperor. The religion spread rapidly, embraced by Prince Shotoku, one of the most visionary rulers in early Japanese history. He built temples, promoted Buddhist philosophy, and drew explicitly on Chinese models of governance.
The great temple complexes of Nara, built in the 8th century, are among the most enduring monuments of this era. The Todaiji Temple, housing a colossal bronze Buddha cast in 752 CE, was the largest wooden structure in the world. It was an act of cultural statement as much as religious devotion, Japan declaring that it could build on the grandest Chinese scale. The legal and administrative system Japan developed during this period, known as the Ritsoyo system, was adapted directly from Tang Chinese law. The layout of Japan's early capitals, first Fujiwara-kyo, then Nara, then Kyoto, was modeled on the grid pattern of Chang'an. The court etiquette, the ceremonial dress, the calendar, the music used in imperial rituals, all of it drawn from China. And yet, something remarkable happened over the following centuries. Japan absorbed all of this influence and then, slowly, steadily, transformed it into something entirely its own. Chinese Buddhism became Japanese Buddhism, branching into Zen, Pure Land, Nichiren, traditions that developed distinct philosophies and aesthetics the original Chinese forms never had. Chinese writing became Japanese writing, the hiragana and katakana syllabaries invented to better represent Japanese language. Chinese court culture became the world of the Heian period, giving rise to the Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, often called the world's first novel, a work of exquisite psychological complexity rooted in Japanese sensibility.
This is one of the most fascinating patterns in the entire relationship: Japan's capacity to absorb without being subsumed, to receive influence and yet remain distinctively, irreducibly itself. The relationship shifted again in the late Heian and Kamakura periods, as Japan developed its own warrior class, the samurai, and its own feudal system. The cultural borrowing from China did not stop, but it became more selective. Japan was no longer a student eager to copy the master. It was a mature civilization, choosing what to incorporate and what to set aside. Trade continued. Zen Buddhism flowed from Tang Dynasty China into Japan's warrior culture, shaping the samurai's philosophy of discipline, presence, and acceptance of death. Chinese ink painting and landscape aesthetics influenced the development of Japanese art. Chinese literature was studied in monasteries and academies. The two civilizations remained deeply connected, but the nature of the connection was changing. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongol ruler of China, Kublai Khan, launched massive invasion fleets against Japan. Both attempts ended in catastrophic failure. The second fleet destroyed by a series of typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze, divine winds. The invasions left a deep imprint on the Japanese psyche. The relationship with China had never been threatening before. Now it had become something more complex. The Ming Dynasty, that eventually replaced Mongol rule in China, had its own complicated relationship with Japan. Japanese pirates, called wako, raided the Chinese coast relentlessly during the 14th and 15th centuries. The Ming court demanded Japan suppress them. The Ashikaga shogunate complied, at least officially, in exchange for the right to trade. The relationship became transactional in a way it had not been before. Then came the late 16th century, and a figure who would leave a rupture in the relationship that echoed for centuries. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the general who unified Japan after a century of civil war, had an ambition that matched the scale of his achievement. He wanted to conquer China. In 1592 and again in 1597, he launched invasions of Korea as a stepping stone to this goal. The invasions were catastrophic. Korean and Chinese forces fighting together ultimately repelled the Japanese armies. Hideyoshi died in 1598. His dream died with him. But the damage was done. Japan had attempted to conquer the continent. China and Korea had not forgotten. The Tokugawa period that followed, from 1603 to 1868, saw Japan deliberately close itself off from much of the world. The policy, known as sakoku, restricted foreign contact to a narrow trickle. Dutch traders at a single island port, Chinese merchants confined to a quarter in Nagasaki. Yet even within these restrictions, Chinese culture continued to flow into Japan. Neo-Confucian philosophy shaped the Tokugawa intellectual world. Chinese literary classics were widely read. Scholars debated the relative merits of Chinese and Japanese culture with intense sophistication. Then came 1853 and the American warships of Commodore Perry, forcing open Japanese ports at gunpoint, and everything changed. Japan's response to this humiliation was unlike anything the world had seen before. Rather than resist modernization or submit to it passively, Japan decided to master it. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 launched one of the most extraordinary transformations in modern history. Japan dismantled its feudal system, sent thousands of students to Europe and America, built railways and telegraph lines and steel mills, created a modern army and navy, and within a single generation, reinvented itself as an industrial power. In this same period, China was going in the opposite direction. The Tang Dynasty, weakened by internal rebellions, opium wars, and the steady encroachment of Western powers, was fragmenting. The civilization that Japan had once revered as the pinnacle of human achievement was visibly struggling. In 1894, Japan and China went to war over control of Korea. The first Sino-Japanese War lasted less than a year. China's defeat was comprehensive and shocking. The peace treaty that followed forced China to cede Taiwan to Japan, pay a massive indemnity, and acknowledge Japanese dominance in the region. The world was astonished. Japan, the student, had defeated China, the master. The reversal was complete. For Japan, the victory confirmed the path it had chosen. For China, it was a national humiliation of the deepest kind, more painful even than the defeats inflicted by Western powers, because this defeat came from a neighbor that China had civilized. Japan's expansion on the continent continued in the following decades. In 1931, the Japanese military seized Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing a puppet state. In 1937, full-scale war between China and Japan erupted. What followed over the next 8 years became one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. The Nanjing Massacre of December 1937 and January 1938 stands as the most searing symbol of this era. Japanese forces entering China's then capital killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war over a period of weeks. The exact numbers remain contested between Chinese and Japanese historians, a dispute that continues to poison relations today. But the scale of the atrocity is beyond question. The Second Sino-Japanese War killed an estimated 14 to 20 million Chinese people. Cities were bombed, villages were burned, chemical weapons were used. The suffering was on a scale that strains comprehension. Japan's defeat in 1945, brought about ultimately by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and by the Soviet declaration of war, ended the conflict. But it did not resolve the history. In the decades that followed, the two countries rebuilt their relationship slowly and carefully.
Japan's 1972 normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China under Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was a diplomatic milestone. Trade grew, investments flowed. Japanese companies built factories in China. Chinese students came to study in Japan. Tourism increased in both directions. But the wounds of the war remained unhealed beneath the surface of this economic relationship. China demanded acknowledgement and apology. Japan offered some expressions of remorse, but never in terms that satisfied China's sense of what full accountability required. Japanese politicians visited the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, and each visit triggered diplomatic crises. Disputes over history textbooks erupted periodically. The legal status of certain uninhabited islands in the East China Sea, called Senkaku in Japanese and Diaoyu in Chinese, became a flashpoint that periodically threatened to escalate into something worse. And yet the relationship kept functioning. Trade between China and Japan reached hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Japanese pop culture, anime, manga, and fashion became enormously popular in China. Chinese tourists flooded into Japan. The two economies became deeply intertwined. What does this history tell us? It tells us that the relationship between China and Japan is one of the most layered in the world. It is not simply a story of rivalry, though rivalry is real. It is not simply a story of cultural kinship, though kinship is real. It is a story of two great civilizations that grew from the same soil, diverged through history, clashed in violence, and are now bound together by geography, economy, and the weight of everything they share. The ancient legacy lives in Japan's writing system, in its architecture, in its Buddhism, in its Confucian ethics, in its aesthetic philosophy, in the very structure of its classical poetry. Japan transformed all of these inheritances into something unmistakably its own. But the Chinese origin is present at every turn, like a genetic code that was rewritten but never erased. And China carries Japan's influence too, in ways that are less visible but real. Japan's early 20th century reforms inspired Chinese reformers. Japanese words entered the Chinese language, particularly in the fields of philosophy, law, and science, concepts Chinese scholars needed, for which they adopted Japanese coinages that were themselves based on Chinese characters. The exchange was never one-directional. Today, as China has risen to become the world's second-largest economy, and Japan remains a major power despite decades of economic stagnation, the relationship is entering a new phase. China's military modernization, its assertiveness in the South and East China Seas, its Belt and Road Initiative projecting influence across Asia and beyond, all of this creates anxiety in Japan. Japan's security alliance with the United States, its slow but steady expansion of its defense capabilities, its efforts to build relationships with other regional powers, all of this creates anxiety in China. The two giants eye each other with a mixture of familiarity and wariness that only centuries of shared history can produce. But step back from the geopolitics, from the territorial disputes and the diplomatic crises and the competing strategic interests, and you see something else. Two nations that gave each other some of the deepest gifts civilization can offer: writing, religion, philosophy, art, architecture, law. The thousand-year relationship of student and teacher, of imitation and transformation, of borrowing and becoming, left permanent marks on both cultures that no war, no rivalry, and no political tension can erase. The East China Sea still lies between them. It was once a bridge. The question that the 21st century must answer is whether it can become a bridge again.